Another important contextual point to make is that it's not one thing. You hear people say, well, we just have to stop cutting down trees and plant some more trees. Or people say everybody has to ride bicycles instead of driving so much. Or it's all the big industry. Well, in fact, it's roughly all of these things. It isn't one thing, it's everything. This depends on the country, but globally speaking, roughly 1/4 of our fossil fuel production comes from generating electricity. Roughly 1/4 comes from agricultural land use and deforestation. Roughly 1/4 comes from industrial processes. And roughly 1/4 in the US, only about 15% elsewhere in the world, comes from transportation. So one can't just attack one of these problems if one wants to address the issue of global warming. One must attack all of these problems. Now, how do we do that? Well, since it's a global problem, we need a global solution. And so in December of 2015, the countries of the world assembled in Paris and issued a declaration of how we're going to address this problem. Unfortunately, it was a statement, not a treaty, so it's not enforceable, and it invoked only pledges, not commitments, of how each country was going to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel. The pledges look something like this. In the US, we pledged to reduce our energy usage to 15.96 tons of CO2 per person by 2030. That still left us far and away the most profligate energy users in the world. China committed to 9 tons of CO2 per person, India to 4.5, and the EU to 6.4. The EU with a comparable standard of living using only about 40% as much energy in terms of CO2 production per person as the US. Well, that was the pledges in 2015, but then of course 2016 came along and the Trump administration withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, meaning there were 193 countries in and 3 countries out, Syria, Nicaragua, and the United States. The subsequent administration re-entered us into that commitment, so it's worth examining in detail what the pledges of Paris mean for the future of global climate. I'm going to show a series of graphs that represent the amount of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere. So this is CO2 itself, and then an increment for methane, nitrous oxides, etc., the equivalent of if they were all CO2. So it's the total greenhouse gas burden on the atmosphere. The axis is in billions of tons per CO2 and is now about 37 or 38 billion tons of CO2, plus another 10 or 11 billion tons of the other greenhouse gases. So at 2020, you see we're at 51 billion tons. And the business as usual graph would have us growing to maybe 55 billion tons by 2030. So the red lines, horizontal lines on these graphs, will represent the business as usual. And of course, there's some uncertainty, so we have a high expectation and a low expectation. What was pledged in Paris was to come down by a few billion tons, not very dramatic, to the pledge, which is going to be shown in green. And again, there's a high path and a low path. What we need to do to actually keep the temperature below 2 degrees centigrade is way down here. That is more like a 30 or 40% reduction by 2030. The required lines will be in purple. Now, you see there's a very wide range between the high path and the low path, because of course we don't know exactly how this will play out. But the median value is probably a good guess. What does this look like country by country? Well, in the US, our business as usual scenario was that we'd be pretty flat over the next 5 years at least. Note that the US could only commit to 5 years, not 10 years like every other country. What we pledged to do was to decline over the next 5 years, we're halfway through that period already, to a value that was closer to 5,000 million tons per total. And what we need to do is be here, a dramatic reduction of more like 50%. What about other countries? China is rapidly industrializing and so rapidly increasing its CO2 production, and its business as usual plan would take it up to more than 12,000 million metric tons in the country per year. Their pledge was to stick more or less at that value, actually to go up a little bit. And what they need to do is be down here by 2030. India is going up as it industrializes. Its business as usual plan would take it up to about the US equivalent now, 5,000 million metric tons per year. It pledged to go higher than that, because of course it is behind its industrialization rate of China. But what it needs to do is not so different than business as usual, because the per capita production in India is relatively low by world standards. And then there's the European Union, which has been decreasing its reliance on fossil fuels over the last 30 years, and business as usual to take it down a little lower than it is today. What it pledged to do was just get a tiny bit lower than that. What it needs to do is be down here by 2030. So to stay below 2 degrees of warming, we're very far, even with the Paris pledges, from achieving our goal. Indeed, at the end of 2019, there were precisely 2 out of the 193 countries that had even met their pledges. They were Morocco and the Gambia, both in Africa, which together comprise about half of 1% of the world's population. They met their 2015 Paris pledges. Of the top 10 emitters, only India was close to being on track to the 2 degrees centigrade of warming required. India, over the last 5 years, has installed 34% of its new energy in solar and hydro. The US, 3.5%.